Welcome to the Seminole Wars. In this podcast, we explore how the Seminole Wars came to be, how they were fought, and how they still resonate some 2 centuries later. I am your host, Patrick Swan, and our show is a production of the Seminole Wars Foundation, found online at www.seminolewars.us. We are recording today from the homestead of the Foundation in Bushnell, Florida. Thank you for listening. Hello and welcome. The U.S. Army that began the Second Seminole War was a small one. Congress historically distrusted large standing armies and disliked even more funding them. As former Secretary of Defense Don Rumsfeld famously remarked about a later conflict, you go to war with the army you have, not the army you might want or wish to have at a later time. Such was the case with the U.S. Army in the Second Seminole War. Fortunately, the Army did not have to fight unassisted. The Secretary of War saw fit to send in the Marines to assist. Joining us today to discuss the historic part played by the U.S. Marine Corps in the Second Seminole War is Dave Eckardt. Dave is the author of the first book on this mobilization and service, aptly titled The U.S. Marines in the Second Creek and Seminole Wars. Dave Eckardt, welcome to the Seminole Wars. So Dave, you've written this book, The U.S. Marines in the Second Creek and Seminole Wars. Why was it so hard to research this book?
All right, having been in the Marines, I was interested in the Marine history. And every book about the Marine history only had a couple paragraphs about the Seminole War, Second Seminole War. And come to find out that a lot of their documentation got lost to a fire. I used contact up at the Marine Archives, and the only thing that they had was 73 pages of orders written by Army General Jessup to Marine Lieutenant Colonel Sam Miller when he was in charge of Tampa Bay and Fort Brooke. And that was all they had, and I eventually found in the National Archives a letter, actually it was a speech that Commandant Henderson gave to the remaining portion of the Marine Regiment when they came back to Washington, D.C. in 1838. Anybody interested in the Second Seminole War, this is a good book for them. It's the only book on the Marine actions during the Seminole War and the Creek War. It's now in Marine Research Library at Quantico and also at the Naval Institute of Annapolis in their research library, and the Atatiki Seminole Museum down in Clewiston.
So Dave, it seems like a preposterous proposition. Marines serving on land in the Second Seminole War. Isn't this why we have an army? How did this anomaly come to pass?
The Marines were used on the land before. In the Revolutionary War, they fought at Princeton with George Washington, and they fought down at New Orleans during the War of 1812. So they were accustomed to being on land as a group. Now, Andrew Jackson, as president and having been an Army general, had tried to eliminate the Marine Corps as president. However, the Congress wouldn't let him do that. When the Second Seminole War and the Second Creek War came about, the Army was always kept small all through our history, probably up until after World War II, because of financial constraints. And during times of need, it would always be supplemented by state militias and the Marines. So when this came about, the Creeks uprose in Georgia and Alabama about the same time as the Seminoles in Florida. So the Army was being stretched kind of thin. Commandant Henderson notified all the Marines at the several different naval yards around the country and told them to pack the gear and get ready to move, leaving just a sergeant's guard at each naval yard and a small detachment at Washington, D.C., where Marines were stationed. Legend has it that after he assembled the men there in Washington and headed out, he had attacked a note on his office door that said, "Guns, fight Indians. Be back when the war is over, A.Henderson." And then they headed south first to Georgia and Alabama from about May of 1836 through the end of September 1836. And from there, they went down to Tampa Bay and got there in October of 1836.
Now, a later Marine Corps Commandant would say, the nation does not need a Marine Corps. The nation wants a Marine Corps. It seems like Commandant Colonel Archibald Henderson knew this. Who was this commandant?
Good old Archie. He was known as the old man of the Marines. He joined the Marines in 1806. He was actually a lieutenant on board the USS Constitution during the War of 1812, and he had several shipboard engagements. He was breveted major in 1814. In October of 1820, then at 37 years old, he was appointed commandant of the Marines, Colonel Commandant.
How large was the Marine contingent that he brought down with him?
A little over 300. He had roughly 18 officers and 303 enlisted men. Now, some of the men were already detached from that body from Alabama. They were assigned to escort some of the creeks out west to the Arkansas Territory, which later became Oklahoma. Plus, that was the Marine Regiment that he brought down. Marines from the Pensacola Naval Yard and the West Indies Squadron, which was a squadron of ships that patrolled the Gulf of Mexico, the Caribbean, and South. Marines from a couple of those ships were actually the first ones to get into Tampa Bay after the Dade Massacre.
What was the Marines' mission in Florida?
Okay, the Marines' mission in Florida was to assist the Army in rounding up the Seminoles to move them out west. So they basically had the same mission as the Army. Henderson, when he got here, was actually the second highest ranking officer. So General Jessup, who was in charge, made him his second in command when they went out in the field.
Once he arrived with his Marines, they had twofold duties in the years 1836 and 1837. What were these duties?
All right, I already mentioned the West Indies Squadron Marines that came ashore to help right after the Dade Massacre. They helped bolster the defenses around Fort Brooke and patrol. Now, when the regiment got there in October 1836, Henderson was put in charge of, they didn't call it Tampa then, they called it Tampa Bay. So he's put in charge of Tampa Bay, Fort Brooke, which was a large complex, a fort plus outlying buildings, and the port, the small port there. Any troops that were coming in and supplies coming in, he had control over all that. January of 1837 is when he took to the field. He had under him, besides most of his Marines, he had Alabama militia, artillery unit, and Creek Indian volunteers. Creek's warriors up in Alabama were given a choice of emigrating right away out west, or the warriors could come down here and help round up the Seminoles. They'd be paid soldiers' wages, given the equipment they needed. So several of them did. So that's what Henderson had under him. Now, a contingent of his Marines were mounted troops. Henderson kept some of them that way, and then some of them were put under Jessup as mounted troops. Now, this isn't the first time Marines were mounted. Back during the Revolutionary War, there was a small contingent of them that were mounted, so that wasn't brand new for them there. Like I said, when Henderson took the field then in January 1837, he and his troops went out searching for Seminoles. Also in 1836, Fort Foster was being built in December. Colonel Foster of the Army was sent up to the river crossing of the Hillsborough River on the military road that ran from Fort Brooke to Fort King up in what is now Ocala. They rebuilt the fort there that had been destroyed. And he had over 300 men, and they built the fort in under 3 weeks. During that period, the Marines and artillery men escorted wagon trains and supplies that went up to Fort Foster. Fort Foster was built to guard the bridge over the river, but also to serve as a supply depot for the troops out in the field, so they wouldn't have to go all the way back to Tampa Bay to get their supplies. The wagon trains would be about 24 wagons, and 24-mile stretch between Fort Brooke and Fort Foster, and they did it in a day. Also in December of 1836, some of the Marines of the West Indies Squadron were attached to an Army unit under Governor Call right before General Jessup took over all the troops in Florida, and they made an assault on Wahoo Swamp, and that was an area along the Withlacoochee where there were large bodies of Seminoles. They had made their home up there. However, General Call's assault on the Wahoo Swamp did not go well, and Marine Lieutenant Ross died of wounds that he received there, and he was the first Marine officer to die in combat since the War of 1812 from wounds.
Well, Dave, as Chris Kimball reminds me, Lieutenant Andrew Ross was originally in the U.S. Army. He served in the 7th Infantry at the Battle of New Orleans in January of 1815. He was in charge of the advance redoubt on the corner of the Rodriguez Canal and the river. The British apparently momentarily overran that corner, but the Americans beat them back. Although he was not to blame, especially against fighting against the strongest army of the time, the British Army, he got a lot of unnecessary blame anyway. Because of that, he went nowhere in his Army career, Chris tells me. Eventually, he resigned to join the Marines because he was frustrated being passed up for promotion. And there he was with the Marines, deployed to Florida. He's wounded at the Wahoo Swamp and died at Fort Heilman. The Marines were involved in other action, too. What happened at Indian Key?
Indian Key was home to several settlers. There was a settlement there. The Indians made an amphibious landing there. Really did a lot of damage, killed several of the settlers. One of them actually got away and paddled his way over to Tea Table Key. And the Navy had built a real small hospital there for sick sailors and Marines. There were a few that were not part of the sick contingent there, and they, along with sailors and Marines that were recuperating in the hospital, loaded a couple small 4-pounder guns on a barge and headed over to Indian Key. In their haste, they grabbed the wrong powder charges for the guns. They grabbed 6-pounder charges. Well, as they neared the island, the Indians actually loaded the cannon that was on Indian Key and actually used it. A couple shots at the barge. They missed. The sailors and the Marines fired the 2 4-pounders with the wrong powder charge, and on the second discharge, both guns went flying off the barge and into the water. They never were recovered for about 35 years. I guess they never made a real serious effort to recover them. However, they did force the Indians off Indian Key.
They also saw some action by a lighthouse. Where was the lighthouse? What happened, and how did the Marines assist?
That was the Cape Florida Lighthouse on Key Biscayne. Mr. Thompson, he was the lighthouse keeper. Saw the Indians coming, so they secured themselves in the lighthouse and went all the way up to the top. The Indians ransacked a couple of small shacks that were there, and then they, at night, they set fire to the door of the lighthouse. Of course, Thompson was firing down on them. His assistant got wounded. The fire at the door of the lighthouse ignited lamp oil inside, and lamp oil ignited the wooden staircase going to the top of the lighthouse. After a while, Wiley tossed down a small keg of gunpowder into the fire, and that killed some of the Indians and drove them off. Well, the explosion and the light of the fire was seen by a passing Navy ship, the Concord. They came ashore in the morning, sailors and Marines, and they had to try to get Thompson down off the lighthouse. His assistant died overnight, so sailors rigged up a kite with a string on it, trying to get the string up to Thompson on top of the lighthouse so he could pull a rope up. But their attempts failed, so a Marine took his ramrod, tied the string to that, put the ramrod in his musket, and fired it over the top of the lighthouse. And, Thompson was able to get the string, and then they tied a rope and locked the tackle onto that. He pulled that up, secured it, and then 2 sailors were able to hoist themselves up there and then lowered him and his assistant down from there. Improvise and adapt and overcome by the Marines.
They also helped settle a conflict between a regular Army colonel and his militia folks. What did that entail?
Oh, yeah. Colonel Lindsay of the Army, he was a pretty strict officer, and he had the misfortune of having Alabama militia under him. They were not the least bit disciplined, and on the march, they would be shooting at anything and everything, just having a good old time on the march. So he restricted the amount of ammunition they could have. Things still got bad, went from bad to worse, so he made sure they didn't have any whiskey. And that was the last straw for them. They cut the mane and tail off his horse one night, made several threats. So 6 Marines of the Concord were designated and assigned to him as his personal bodyguard for as long as he had those Alabama militiamen with him.
The Marines were also called by Governor Call, who was panicky, as well as the Florida residents. So he sent a message to Navy Commodore Dallas and said, "We need Marines, we need somebody to come up." And so what happened with that?
Right after the Dade Massacre, there were some minor attacks up along the Panhandle around Apalachicola, and then a lot of rumors of Indians being nearby. So Commodore Dallas was requested to send Marines ashore on several occasions anytime there was a rumor of Indians and whenever there was an attack on a settler. So they were constantly, and later, not just right after the Dade Massacre, but later on, they were constantly patrolling around the rivers and inlets there and the Panhandle and around the bend, the Big Bend there in Florida. Those were Marines off the West Indies fleet ships.
Apparently they didn't find many Seminole, and Commodore thought it was kind of a wasted effort.
Yeah, they had a few minor skirmishes, but Indians, the Seminoles, were pretty good at keeping themselves out of sight.
Now, there came a period where Colonel Henderson believed that the war was over, that peace had been achieved, and so he brought his Marine regiment back up to Washington. Yet there were still Marines there. They were Marines from this West Indies squadron.
In January and February of 1837, when Henderson took his Marines and militia and Indians to the creeks out within Jessup, and his portion, his brigade, were out. They were all searching mid-Florida for Seminoles. Henderson and his men fought one of the larger engagements, actually, of the war, one-day running battle with the Seminoles over at Hatchalustee Creek. And Hatchalustee Creek is today known as Reedy Creek, and it's on the western boundary of Disney World. So they had a one-day running battle with the Seminoles through the swamps over there, Hatchalustee Creek. Captured over 100 of their horses loaded with all their worldly goods. By the end of the day, the Seminoles, having lost all their possessions and supplies, and were tired of being chased all over the place, decided to enter into talks about immigration. And over the next couple months, they had several talks with Jessup. They agreed to bring all their people in over to Tampa Bay. They did this by April of 1837. Everybody thought, oh, great, they're all coming in, the war is over. The militia units started being sent home. In May, Henderson got permission to take half of his regiment back up north, which he did. And then a couple of militant chiefs came through and intermingled with the Seminoles there waiting to go out west and decided and convinced them they really didn't want to go. So they all took off and disappeared. War started up again. The half of the regiment that was left behind was left in charge of Lieutenant Colonel Sam Miller of the Marines, who had been in charge of Tampa Bay once Henderson had taken the Marines out in the field. Miller had an illustrious background during the War of 1812. He was in charge of Marines and some sailors at Bladensburg, Maryland. They were the last troops to hold the British from being able to get into Washington City. There were militia with them, but the militia, after a while fighting the British, took off. They left the Marines there. They fought the British off until they ran out of ammunition and they left. Legend has it that the British commander was so impressed with the stand that the Marines made that when they got into Washington and started burning government buildings, out of respect for the Marines, they did not burn the Marine headquarters or the Commandant's house. Besides the half of the regiment there, still had the West Indies Squadron Marines doing patrols, also along South Florida. A few months later, Sam Miller had to get reassigned because of his health, as I recall. So Captain William Delaney was left in charge. Now, he took Marines down around Fort Myers area, Sanibel, in that area, and he was instructed to build a fortification at Punta Rosa, and he built a small fort there to house supplies and aptly name it Fort Delaney.
What were some of the firsts that the Marines experienced from this entire mobilization and service?
The first time that they moved by train, first time they moved by steamboat, the first time they tried revolving rifles, repeating rifles. They ended up packing them away right away. The Colt revolving rifle, whether it was because they were kept loaded too long or they were incorrectly loaded. If you've ever fired a black powder revolver, there are sometimes where the chamber that you want to goes off, but the one next to it also goes flying off to the side. And That's what they were experiencing with the Colt revolving rifles. Some of them actually exploded, which injured, I think, 5 Marines, so they packed those things away. They also tried the Hall's breech-loading rifle. That didn't work too well after firing several shots because of the buildup of the powder residue in it. So they gave up on that too and just stuck with their muskets.
The most famous thing, probably a first for the Marines, was the Riverine Warfare that they engaged in with the Navy through the Everglades. What was Riverine Warfare that the Squadron Marines perfected south in the Everglades?
Navy Lieutenant Powell first started the sailors and Marines of the West Indies Squadron down along over on the east coast of Florida, where Miami, Fort Lauderdale is now, and around the west coast, and through the Everglades. They had specially built canoes. Some were 5-man canoes, some were 10-man canoes, and then there were even some 30-man canoes. They would patrol rivers and inlets around the island, searching for Seminoles. Sailors and Marines were also the first white men to ever cross the Everglades. They left from Fort Dallas, which is Miami today, and spent just under 3 weeks going across and coming out on the west coast where they were picked up by the ships. This was at the end of December 1840 and January 1841. They spent almost their entire time in those canoes, except for when they found some dry land. And usually if they found dry land, there was a abandoned Seminole village, whether it was they were recently abandoned or abandoned for long periods of time. And there were actually areas where they came across crops that the Seminoles had planted, pumpkins, peas, corn, a couple other things, which they would root up and destroy. They only caught a few Seminoles on that particular trip. They made another crossing in 1840. However, this time they spent a total of 51 days going back and forth across the Everglades. And a young midshipman named Preble wrote a journal about their 51-day trek across the Everglades. And he later life actually became an admiral. He described the number of canoes, the size of canoes, the number of naval officers, the number of sailors, the number of marine officers, the number of Marines on this trek, and just described the whole trip. And also, he did this through the eyes of a teenager, which he was. It's all about the food. He talked about how they had fish jumping into the canoes, so they had fresh fish. They'd get occasional bear and deer, raccoons. They always have plenty of fresh eggs, raiding all the wading birds in there. And every now and then they'd kill a rattlesnake or a cottonmouth and cook them too. But he indicated how when they did find dry land, the Marines would usually get out and make foot patrols going around and then meet the boats up. There were sections where the swamp grass was so matted down they could actually walk across it. But when they pushed the push poles down through the grass, they couldn't touch bottom. The water was that deep under it. So they had quite the time going through there. And then again, they didn't come across too many Seminoles. They did find some. And every once in a while, one would actually lead them to the next village, but usually the village is already deserted. The methods that they used were used later by the sailors and Marines during the Civil War on the blockade of the South. The Navy was tasked with blockading all the states of the South. And here in Florida especially, the sailors and Marines on board those ships didn't necessarily spend all their time on the big ships. They spent most of their time in the ship's boats, rowing into the inlets, into the rivers, around the island, searching for goods ready to be smuggled out, searching for some of the blockade running ships, and runaway slaves and salt works. So they spent a lot of hours using the techniques learned in the Second Seminole War. And the Navy also pulled out the history books and journals and studied it when it came time for Vietnam. And they used the same search and destroy methods that they used during the Second Seminole War over in Vietnam, the Mekong Delta, and around the rivers, inlets over there. So they did learn some practices that got used later in time.
Marines are tough, but service in Florida would challenge even the toughest Marine. How tough was service for the Marines in Florida in general and in the Everglades especially?
It was definitely tough. The heat alone, endless mosquitoes and bugs, in the long hours of either rowing boats or hiking through the hinterland in search of the Seminoles. So it was tough duty. The one good thing was there was always plenty of fresh food. Cattle was plentiful across the river from Fort Brooke. They maintained cattle herds. They didn't always have to rely on their salt beef and salt pork. They would have fresh beef. Plus, plenty of fish, plenty of wild game, citrus. There was a lot of citrus around. So they did eat fairly well. They didn't always have to rely on their hard bread.
As we look back on the Marines' glorious past, how does this fit into it?
This was good strengthening of the Corps itself. To have them all together as a main unit and function together. They learned tactics that got used later. And Henderson himself really laid a lot of foundations for the Corps as it expanded in later years. So it was a good defining moment for the Marines to be able to work along with the Army and the Navy during these years. As it was, they were part of the Department of the Navy. So on shipboard, they were under the control of the Navy. On land, they would be put under the control of the Army.
And they bought themselves a few years at least before there were future calls to say, well, we really don't need a Marine Corps.
Yes, there were several attempts all through the years to fold the Marines into the Army, but they always managed to avoid that.
How did you get interested in the Marines and in the Seminole Wars?
Graduated from high school in '69 and joined the Marines right after that. Spent a little time in Vietnam doing signals intelligence. Always interested in history and the Marine history also. So like I said earlier, that every Marine history book I ever came across only spent a couple paragraphs on the Second Seminole War, which seemed kind of strange since it lasted 7 years. But I got started reenacting as a Civil War Marine. There was a small unit up in Brooksville one year, and I got involved with them. As time went on, I started doing research on that. I was a couple magazine articles on the Marines during the Civil War here in Florida. And I also discovered that a Marine was awarded the Medal of Honor for an attack he made up on Crystal River during the Civil War. And then I was invited to go up to Fort Foster for a candlelight event one year. Since I didn't know at that time the Marines were up there, I just went as a militiaman. And then when I found out the Marines actually manned that fort, I got to digging into the history, and I had to use all kinds of sources to put this book together. I located General Jessup's 3 journals during that time period. I actually got my hands on one up at the University of Florida in Gainesville. Another one I found online. The third one was in Harvard University Library. It took me about a year to find that one just because of the way it was listed online. So I called them and said, oh, sure, we'll make you a copy. So they did and sent it. And then there were other journals of Colonel Foster. Marine Lieutenant Sprague actually resigned from the Marines and then joined the Army during the Second Seminole War. And years later, he wrote a really good book on the Second Seminole War. But it's mostly from his experiences in the Army, except for when he took Creek Indians out to Arkansas territory. Plus, Henry Prince wrote Amidst the Storm of Bullets. That was a good source. And in there was a reference to spoke highly of the Marines when they came into Tampa Bay, and highly of Commandant Henderson. But he also indicated that he had a nickname called Old Fist to Windward. And I have never been able to find out how he got that nickname. Even talking with people of the Marine Archives, couldn't find anything on that. So it must have been something that happened on shipboard. Somebody who was relieving himself in the wrong direction and probably got it all back on him. But yeah, that was an interesting little find.
So Dave, what's the value of reenactors and or living historians who go out to sites and engage with the public?
It enhances their knowledge of history, which even in speaking with kids who are in school now learning history, we really supplement their knowledge of it. Apparently, it's a lot thinner knowledge that they're taught these days. And from when I went through school, it was pretty intense what we learned. I give talks at reenactment events, at schools, Tampa Bay History Center several times, and civic groups also. I find there's a lot of people that know so little about history. And that's a shame, especially what's going on today with people wanting to tear down statues of historical figures, and they really don't know what all is behind it. I've really enjoyed doing this, interacting with people and helping to increase their knowledge of our history.
So you have a Marine uniform of the era. They had a winter uniform, they had a summer uniform. But the thing our listeners want to know is, do you have the leather neck?
Okay, the leather neck off. This was very common in militaries, like during the 1700s. It was to protect the neck against sword blows. The Marines kept them actually up through the Civil War. However, they were more ornamental to be worn with a dress uniform more than anything. Now, I wore one all day one time just to see what it was like at a reenactment. It really wasn't too bad, but in the heat down here, you wouldn't want to be wearing it. Their summer uniform was white, which was common for militaries all around the world, made out of linen or cotton, and made those materials mainly because they were cheap, and it was white because they wouldn't spend the money on dye. The winter uniform was gray wool, and there again, that was common for most militaries. The Army had a sky blue wool for winter. Now, during the reenactment, I've gone from using the gray wool to staying in the summer white. I got tired of explaining to people, yeah, it's a gray uniform, but it's not a Confederate uniform. So people just tend to see gray and think Confederate.
And no leather neck.
Nope, don't wear the leather neck. I'll put it on display so people can see what it is.
Dave Eckardt, thank you for joining us today.
Glad to do it. And Semper Fi.
If you enjoyed this show, please take a moment to like us on Facebook at Seminole Wars Foundation. Leave a review on iTunes or your favorite podcast provider. Your reviews and comments help new listeners discover us and help us keep the show going. Visit our website at www.seminolewars.us for blogs, articles, news, books, events, membership information, and how to subscribe to this podcast. We'll be back soon with a new episode of the Seminole Wars Podcast. The Seminole Wars Foundation is a 501c3 nonprofit organization dedicated to preservation, education, and publication of Seminole Wars history throughout the state of Florida. This podcast is copyrighted the Seminole Wars Podcast 2020, all rights reserved. Front bumper music, The Devil's Garden, Roast 'em, provided by kind permission of Reedy Youngman. Back bumper music, Second Seminole Win, by Jed Merrim and Ricky Pittman, courtesy of Ricky Pittman, all rights reserved.